We're going to briefly talk about two more cranial nerves before we wrap up our discussion on those. The specifics of all of them are not really required, but I thought it'd be interesting to bring up a couple for you to peruse, to observe, to understand. What you would have seen was the origin of the cranial nerves and where they spread to through the head and neck. And the cranial nerves largely innervate and provide sensory information to and from the head and the neck, with one exception coming up next that ventures a bit further down into the torso. But as far as limbs and all the external superficial structures, cranial nerves are not involved. Those are spinal nerves that we're going to talk about later today. Cranial nerves are very central. Head, neck, some deeper, visceral, important organs. I thought I would introduce the vestibulocochlear nerve because this is one where you read it on a page, you immediately forget it. It's too complicated. What does it mean? I don't want to pay attention. I'm not going to remember this one. But this is a great example where the name identifies the target or what it does. Vestibulocochlear is a nerve that specifically brings auditory signals from the inner ear to the brain. And there are two branches, the vestibular branch and the cochlear branch. The two branches are described in the name, and if we understand the structures, which we don't yet, but we will when we look at the inner ear, the vestibule of the ear receives information from the eardrum about sound, and the cochlea allows us to understand information about our head in space. The inner ear being really important for orientation. If you close your eyes and move your head around, you know when you're pointing your head up to the side or if you're upside down. A lot of that sensory perception, proprioception, comes from the inner ear. So the vestibule and the cochlea connect with the vestibular and the cochlear branches of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Is that repetitive enough? So we get equilibrium information on balance and auditory signals from these two branches. We know it's completely sensory. The eighth cranial nerve, to touch and feel, very, the vestibular. Some say Mary Money, but my brother says sensory. Do that with any nerve. Easy peasy. So it's in the name. The two branches are in the name, and then if we understand those structures, we can figure out what it does. Hearing signals and balance. We don't understand the structures quite yet because we haven't investigated the special senses in depth. The last cranial nerve that I want to bring up is the vagus nerve, and this is the one that dives deeper into the torso. That's not only limited to the head and neck. It does still innervate and provide information from very critical organs, but these are organs deep in the torso, visceral organs. The vagus nerve is the only other V cranial nerve, the 10th nerve. Provides both motor and sensory, if you're keeping track, to many important tissues. You can see the lungs, you can see the heart, liver, stomach, intestines. This was the nerve when I went off on a tangent earlier in the course and we talked about gut bacteria that can activate nerves. This is the nerve that gut bacteria can signal if they want you to provide them with more delicious, whatever your vice is, candy, Oreos, pizza, chips, vegetables, baby. So it provides sensory information from a whole host of visceral organs, the important ones that keep you alive. Heart, lungs, spleen, liver, intestines. When we talked about feedback loops, we used blood pressure as an example of a negative feedback loop. If blood pressure goes too high, something senses it, sends the signal to the brain, which creates a plan. The things that sense blood pressure going too high are carotid bodies and aortic bodies. They contain baroreceptors that measure pressure. And so the vagus nerve is what relays that information to the brain. This is the afferent side of that negative feedback loop. On the motor side, on the effector side, the vagus nerve is largely tasked with rest and digest activities. Which kind of makes sense considering the tissue that innervates. But at rest, it limits heart rate. At rest, it helps modulate digestion. It helps maintain respiration at a smooth, even, low level. So the motor efferent nerves coming from the vagus nerve are meant to help pin these organs in a resting scenario, a normal basal resting scenario. Normal breathing rate, normal heart rate, normal digestion, help to squish the contents of the stomach and move it distally. We'll see that all in the second semester. Notable because it's not limited to the head and neck, and it involves many of these critical visceral organs. So that's what I want to touch on today as far as cranial nerves go. The plan for the rest of lecture, in 20-ish minutes that I've set aside, is to talk about the spinal cord, introduce spinal nerves, and then we'll do a brief review for tomorrow's midterm. You've seen, those of you that have been to lab already, some of this information already. The spinal cord is the other part of the central nervous system. We focused only on the brain so far and the nerves arising from the brain. This is online, right? Hear a lot of... Yeah? Okay, good. There's a lot of moving around and what sounded like disgruntled sighs, but maybe that's just that I mentioned the midterm. So the spinal cord helps with processing reflexes. We'll look at examples of those at the end of this section. We'll start to introduce some specialized terms. We're not going to pay attention to these so much right now. We will look at them in detail when we talk about action potentials. But the spinal cord is a major site of integration. And you can think of excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. Kind of like the angel and the devil on your shoulder. Like imagine peer pressure. Many people are telling you to do something. You might be of a mind that you should do it then, or many people are telling you not to do something. The net sum of all those signals is integrated by the spinal cord. So some things that have just one EPSP might get a small reaction. Some signals that send many EPSPs, the spinal cord will register all of those, summate that signal, and the net effect, the net signal might be larger. So that's something that we'll come back to when we talk more about action potentials, but the spinal cord is a major site of that integration. And it can either integrate the signals locally to make an automatic reaction or a spinal reflex, or it can send the information to the brain, up the spinal cord. If it needs to bring in higher processing power to understand or create a plan, it can send those signals to the brain and relay them to the cerebrum. It may or may not relay the signals if it desires, or if it's necessary. And we'll look at situations where each is warranted. So the spinal cord, right now we think of it as this long cylinder, this tube, down the back, in the dorsal cavity of the body, surrounded by vertebrae. We don't know a lot about vertebrae yet, but the spinal cord is the reddish pink structure. The green lines are tracks or signals being sent up and down the spinal cord. The blue blobs are the vertebrae, which we're going to touch on later. And surprise, surprise, the spinal cord is protected and it's wrapped in meninges, which are the same as those that wrap the brain. These are continuations of the same meninges that wrap and protect the brain. Dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. There's still a subarachnoid space that contains cerebrospinal fluid. Remember, the entire central nervous system floats in a pool of cerebrospinal fluid in that subarachnoid space. The entire central nervous system wrapped in these three meninges in the same order. You'll see them peeled back here. A couple things that are obviously different in this case. We have some projections. The nerves that arise from the spinal cord pierce those layers. So you can see what looks like the ends of a corn or a wire broom or a brush or something like that. The little rootlets pierce those layers, merge together, and create nerves that go to the rest of the body. So that's a little bit different than in the brain when we first looked. Also, a notable structure to help keep things secure and in place, we see denticulate ligaments, which are little projections of the pia mater, the innermost meninx that wraps the central nervous system. These are really tightly associated with the tissue, so with the spinal cord, and they converge and anchor the spinal cord vertically to the other meninges. Denticulate ligaments. We observed those here. We didn't see them in the brain when we last looked. But otherwise, same meninges, same order, same structure, same roles. We've seen this before. And so this is what part of the spinal cord looks like. We take it in as a whole and start to unpack this amorphous cylinder that we think of when we think spinal cord. Well, there's a lot of detail on this slide. There's a lot that we could know about the spinal cord, but let's pick out a few interesting pieces of information. First, we should know where it starts and ends. What are the borders of the spinal cord? Spinal cord begins as an extension of the medulla oblongata. That was the most inferior portion of the brain that sat immediately superior to the spinal cord. They're continuous. At the end of the medulla, you can consider the spinal cord starting. And this happens at the level of the foramen magnum. And I'll come back to that in a second. It continues in that state until it reaches the end of the spinal cord at L2. You might have heard of L2 or L3, C7. These letter number combinations are names for the vertebrae of the spinal cord, or the vertebral column. So L2 is the second lumbar vertebra, and that would be about in this region where the red line is. You can see them all numbered sequentially. The letters, we're not concerned with them yet, but we'll see what they stand for when we get to that section in the bone and joints. So the end of the spinal cord is at the red line. The start of the spinal cord we can't really see here, and we've never taken a look at what the foramen magnum is. Foramen, remember, passageway or hole. Magnum, generally associated with large. Magnus also means large. Foramen magnum is the big hole in the skull that allowed the spinal cord to pass through as it leaves the skull. So this is an underside view, an inferior view of the bottom of the skull, and the foramen magnum, you can guess, is that big hole in the middle. As the medulla and the spinal cord passes through that foramen magnum, if it crosses, you can imagine a force field across the opening of that hole. As it passes through that plane, it becomes the spinal cord. What else is interesting? Even though the spinal cord ends at L2, we still see nerves and different structures continuing onwards. For most of us, it continues as what's called the cauda equina, or horse's tail. It's not one cylinder at this point, but it starts to fan out. All of the nerves disperse in the lower lumbar region and the sacrum. And you can see it looks kind of like a horse's tail, all of these nerve fibers fanning out to go to the lower limbs. And with the denticulate ligaments, the length of the spinal cord, there's one other important anchor, and that's the filum terminale, which anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx, the very tip, the inferior tip of the vertebral column. It's part of the pelvis, right down here. And the filum terminale is a thread or a special composite of all of the meninges. Dura, arachnoid, pia merge together. They don't just stop. They create the filum terminale that anchors to the coccyx. And that's how it's anchored at the base or the inferior aspect of the spinal cord. Now, a lot of detail is showing up here on the right-hand side, and we're going to talk about the overall or overview structure of some of these nerves and the levels of the spinal column and the plexuses. We will spend some time looking in depth at the brachial plexus. This is one of my favorite plexuses. I've dislocated my shoulders 2 or 3 times, 4 times. And this is one of the susceptible regions when you do that. The humerus can squish and impinge on nerves in the brachial plexus. And there's a fun mnemonic that we can use to help remember all the structures there when we get to that section. So we'll look at plexuses coming up overall, but we'll spend time on the brachial plexus. The others we'll kind of gloss over. Now, if I were to take just a general arbitrary slice at some point in the spinal cord, you would get a cross-section that looks like this, something that you've seen in lab before. Lots of detail. Here again, many small, fine structures. And if you are only shown this cross-section, it's difficult to know where you are in the spinal cord or how it's oriented. And so the first things that you want to do are try to orient them. It's really hard to tell where in the spinal cord you are, although there are some tricks. Some key defining features, you'll see there's a fissure or a little break in the spinal cord on the anterior surface. That's not on the back or the posterior surface. The anterior median fissure tells you which way is anterior. A second giveaway that I like to use are the ganglia, the posterior root ganglia. Always are on the back or the posterior side, the nerves in the posterior half of the spinal column. It's tempting to try to use the shape of the gray and the white matter in the spinal column, but that changes. As you move inferior, the shape changes. It connects to one border, it moves away from that border, it gets thicker in some portions, so I don't find that as reliable as using the anterior median fissure and the posterior ganglia. Now, I don't want to repeat too much of what's been said in lab, but we want to look at the nerves. The nerves are why we're here. The tracts that send information we'll briefly touch on in a little bit, but the nerves are why we're here. And at every pair, or for every vertebra in the vertebral column, a pair of spinal nerves arise. And so you can imagine one vertebra sitting on top of this section. And then the spinal nerves, shown here in yellow, emerge just beneath it, right above the next vertebra below it. And between every pair of bones, you have a pair of spinal nerves that arise and then go out to do whatever they need to do. It's very general at this point. And those spinal nerves contain both motor and sensory information. They all do. And we can tell as we look at the one-way flow of information in the spinal cord. So these spinal nerves are made of anterior and posterior nerves. Anterior and posterior spinal nerves, or roots. You'll see them commonly referred to as roots. So the smaller branches of a spinal nerve are roots. If you're looking closely, the roots have smaller branches themselves. These were those small projections that pierced all the meninges. Those are rootlets. Smaller roots. Every pair of spinal nerves is made from the anastomosis, or the joining, the merging of anterior and posterior roots. And you can see with these cartoon-shaped or colored neurons on the lower right-hand portion, and you know with the mnemonic that you saw in lab, the directionality of information flow is described by this mnemonic. AMPS, anterior is motor, posterior is sensory. So information comes in at the back. There's either an immediate reflex and it leaves at the front, or it's transmitted up to the brain, a response is generated and sent back, and then it leaves on the anterior, or in the anterior root. If your name is Dave, it's pretty easy to remember. AMPS is also easy to remember, but if your name is Dave, it's doubly easy. Dorsal, afferent, ventral, efferent, if you prefer. You could also use these two together to remember what afferent and efferent mean. Dorsal is posterior, so afferent is sensory. Okay. If that's not too complicated. So these spinal nerves, there's a pair of spinal nerves made up of spinal roots that leave between each pair of vertebrae and go out to the periphery to activate muscles, to activate glands, to bring information from the skin and the plexuses that surround the roots, the hair follicles and the dermis, all sorts of activities. I want to look briefly inside one spinal nerve, and we'll do some review. The spinal nerves are really where the peripheral nervous system arises. This is the connection point between the central processing and the peripheral effectors. The sensory organs, the muscles, the spinal nerves are the junction between the central nervous system and peripheral. There are a total of 31 pairs, and this is generally fixed. 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And we can actually map. It's really interesting. I didn't throw the slide in, but you can map from whatever level on the spinal cord you happen to be looking, a comparable region at the skin of the body. So if I look at a spinal nerve at L2, it generally goes to the skin in a band around your torso, around L2. I'm looking at the cervical vertebrae up here. It usually innervates the skin around the cervical vertebrae at the top. It's really interesting to see that tiered hierarchy and segmentation. The anterior and posterior roots merge to make a spinal nerve and then immediately break apart again. That's coming up. But let's imagine the spinal nerve. The anterior and posterior roots merge together. Well, every spinal nerve must carry both motor and sensory information then, right? The anterior was motor. The posterior was sensory. Those are merging, so motor and sensory information are in every spinal nerve. And the closer we look to the spinal cord, the larger we can see the nerve as it exits. So as it leaves the spinal cord, this nerve is as thick or as large in diameter as it's going to be. As it progresses out into the body, it will divide and send fibers to respective tissues of interest. It'll get smaller and smaller as it branches out into the periphery. At the spinal cord, it's as thick as it's going to be. And we can see the constituent parts that make up a spinal nerve shown here. And I want to introduce to you the idea of these layers or these wrappings. We're going to see this here, and we're going to see it when we talk about muscle, almost identically. And the names are going to seem a little bit out of left field, but the prefix gives a sense of what covering you're looking at. and the suffix tells you what it's covering. So epineurium, epi around the border, neurium, a nervous tissue or a neuron. The outer covering makes for the entire nerve. This outer wrapping covers the entire nerve. At that point, we're looking at one spinal nerve. But within each spinal nerve, like you can imagine, because all of these fibers are merging together and then dividing as they go to peripheral tissues, we have bunches or bundles of axons. And one bundle might go to one tissue, another bundle might go to another tissue. Each bundle is called a fascicle. Fascicles are wrapped in perineurin. Peri around the perimeter of the fascicle. We can drill down slightly further within each bunch or bundle of nerve fibers. We have individual axons. Remember, the axon is the long projection of one nerve cell, of a neuron. So each one of these axons is one nerve cell that's typically wrapped in myelin, which you've heard in lab that we haven't talked about in depth yet, and another protective covering called endoneurium. So epi, peri, endo gets progressively more and more intimate or closer to the structure. Neurium indicates it's a neural wrapping. We'll see something very similar when we look at muscle. But from here, at its thickest point, these fascicles will branch off, go to specific muscles or different regions of the same muscle to be able to innervate and or provide sensory information from those tissues. So there technically is one more slide in this section, but I think this is enough information for now. We've talked about the roots merging together, creating a spinal nerve. You know they break apart and divide right away. That's what's coming up next. We'll revisit that on Tuesday next week, not tomorrow. Something else is going on tomorrow. I forgot what that is. But we'll revisit this on Tuesday.